Hey everyone, and welcome to the College Chats podcast. On this episode, we're going to talk with our guest about the changing face of the college game, but also as he resides deep in the heart of Big Ten country, it would be remiss of us not to talk about his expectations for the Big Ten this season. But first, with the chaps, and with Alex doing volleyball stuff in Central Europe, I am joined by someone who knows more about the MAC than the MAC does itself. Oliver, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing very well, thank you, sir. That's the best podcast introduction I've had for at least a week. So
For at least a week.
that
I,
was
I,
that was awesome. I enjoyed
I
that.
I heard you on a competitor podcast saying that was the best introduction they'd had all year. So I don't know what to say about that. Called out on your own podcast. Our guest is no stranger to the chaps. And to be fair, we love having him on to talk to us. He spent last evening at the awesome Wrigley Field, where he enjoyed the company of Brett Bielema, who had a lot to say about, well, everything, which we might touch on later. So it's a long overdue welcome back to one of our absolute favourite guests, ESPN's senior college football writer, Adam Rittenberg. Adam, hi. How's the Windy City treating you?
It's treating me great, guys. Great to hear from you and great to be back on the show. It means college football is getting closer, which is a very exciting thing, as we know.
Yes, we can now genuinely start counting the weeks, which is awesome. Um, Ollie and I were talking about we didn't speak to you last year. I'm not quite sure how that is. We're going to sack our booking agent after this, but um, a lot has changed since we last spoke, Adam. A lot, and we spent the last couple of weeks talking about the changes to college football, mostly about the House settlement, but also about impending changes to the college football playoff, which we'll touch about later on. But I guess this last week, 10 days, there's been a lot of heated debate about clearinghouses and their involvement in the game. Now we've moved kind of, I think, beyond the House settlement. So my question to you is the clearinghouse going to be the new sheriff in town that we need, or do you think the Wild West is going to get even wilder?
Yeah, again, I think it's natural to be skeptical just because you're talking about a sport where people have always found workarounds, and even though on the surface it seems like it's a thing that should legitimize the NIL marketplace. There will be ways to move money and create deals and get around. That's how this sport works, and so it'll be interesting to see like which programs benefit the most from this model. I think we all know which ones benefited the most from the original model. I think we saw some programs that have and continue to benefit from the transfer portal era and the NIL era. And then you wonder who will really come out better off with the revenue sharing. One thing that you mentioned, Brett Bielema, he talked about this last night, that the portal has really evened the playing field, and I think there's hope that if you're at a program that isn't one of those traditional top 10, top 15 type programs, that the revenue share era and that goes along with the portal clearinghouse and everything that's going on will further even things out so that we're going to have more stories like Arizona State and SMU and Indiana in the coming years. I still am, believe that the top programs will be the top programs and they'll have better access to talent. But I was sitting in Ryan Day's office not that long ago, and we were talking about how do you Ohio State that just won a national championship and still has one of the most talented rosters, if not the most in the country, maintain your edge in recruiting because he understands that some of the changes that have been made are probably more beneficial to programs that don't have Ohio State's history and budget and reach. And so I think it remains to be seen. But again, I was very encouraged by the first year of the playoff to see who made it and that we're talking about more than just a handful of teams because I think that otherwise you really run the risk of having people tune out from your sport when there's only a few teams that have a real chance.
And of course, you make the most valid point of all. When we were doing a review of last season, we've talked to a number of people about this. Last season was probably the greatest football season on record, certainly that we can remember, right, in terms of competition and excitement and drama. There was drama almost from the first week in college football. So as much as there's been a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth over the last few weeks, we do have an exciting product to watch, don't we?
No, absolutely. And, I think especially once you get kind of past that upper rung of teams, there's a real drama. I mean, you look at the Big 12. I was doing some radio earlier today about that was about the Big 12, and there's so many ways you can go in that conference. In the Big 10, sure, it starts with Penn State and Ohio State and Oregon, but then there's a tier that could go a number of different directions. Maybe it's Indiana again, maybe it's Illinois, maybe it's Iowa, maybe it's somebody else, Michigan. And then in the SEC, I think, yes, there's a larger group of teams that probably are capable of winning a national championship, but I think there's more uncertainty now that Nick Saban is no longer at Alabama, and Georgia has gone a couple of years without winning a national championship, which again, they went decades without winning a national championship, but then they won two. And so you kind of wondered, oh, they're going to do this every year. Well, they haven't won the last two, and they have questions going into this season. So, can Texas get it done? Is LSU going to make a playoff again? There's some really fun conversations, and then even all the way down to the group of five. What does Boise State do now after making the playoff but losing Ashton Jeanty? And is this Memphis's year? Is it Tulane's year? Is it what's going to happen with Notre Dame? There's just a lot more on the plate than I think when we went into many seasons, guys, knowing that only a few teams could make the 14 playoff and maybe 2 or 3 could win it. I think that's a little bit broader of a conversation right now.
For what it's worth, in that conversation, you mentioned Memphis and Tulane. I think it's Navy's year this year in the group of five. I really do. SEC and Big Ten, you touched on at length there, Adam, and that's because obviously those two conferences are really the front runners of power in college football right now and for the future moving forward as well. But there has been, we touched on it a couple of weeks ago with Ross Dellinger, we touched on the power struggle almost between the SEC and Big Ten as it comes to shaping of the college football playoff format, as it comes to the SEC's conference scheduling. How do you see that shaking out? How's that stalemate end up playing out and being resolved, do you think?
Well, it's interesting, Ollie. The leagues are working together more than they ever have. When I started covering the Big Ten for ESPN, there was a real rivalry and there was a respect, but it was us and them. It was separate. And now, again, there's a lot more collaboration. I was at one of the college football playoff meetings earlier this year in Dallas, and the commissioners would come out to go to the bathroom or whatever, take a break, and Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti would be like attached at the hip. I mean, they're very much caucusing separately. And then you have the spring meeting season where it felt like the SEC went into its meetings with maybe a little bit more aligned with the Big Ten on a future playoff model, and then came out of those meetings much closer to where maybe the ACC and the Big 12 are with the 5 and 11 format. We haven't heard a whole lot from the Big Ten. Haven't heard much from Tony Petitti at all, their commissioner. We've heard from a few coaches. Brett Bielema weighed in last night. Ryan Day talked to me about his preference for a model. And, again, I think the Big Ten's position is, we don't need to rush into anything. I mean, we don't have to expand this thing. We believe, and I think they're right in this belief, that every conference that's part of a playoff, every conference that feeds into a playoff system should have the same number of conference games. And you can throw all the data you want about, well, our 8 are harder than your 9. It's just a hard argument to wrap your head around, guys. I don't know how you feel. And I don't know if there's a comp in the EPL or somewhere, in sports over there. But it's an unequal number of games that you play in your conference. Like how much longer can you really stand on that and say, oh, well, yeah, we can all feed into the same playoff and have these rules that we're all abiding by. So I think the Big Ten's position is, okay, if you want to go to a 5 and 11 or whatever the model is, let's at least all agree to play the same number of conference games or the same number of power opponents. And I think that's a reasonable request. And again, I'm not in the Big Ten office, but if I were them, I wouldn't back down from that. I wouldn't just rush into a 16-team system and do what these other conferences want to do if they're not going to adjust on their end, which is very much in their control. And it is kind of laughable, what Brett Bielema was saying last night about the SEC coaches voting against going to 9 conference games. Of course, coaches want to win, and that makes it harder to win. But sometimes you get overruled. And I think for the fans and for the game, I think we'd all agree more SEC football is better. then less SEC football. So, it's just it's a conversation piece of this that has gone on, I think, far too long, and we're still talking about it.
Adam, I just want to play a little bit of the devil's advocate with the mindset of the two conferences with the two different formats, because I wrote a piece for Pro Football Network last week that looked at what the 2025 playoff would look like with both of the two 16 team formats based on what our power rankings are for this coming season. And actually, the 5-11 format benefits the SEC in terms of the number of teams they would likely get in at large, whereas the format proposed by the Big Ten really limits what the SEC has in the final 16 teams. How much of from the SEC standpoint is them realizing that could be the case, and also that the Big Ten is actually a bigger power broker than they really imagined possible? The SEC has always considered themselves above every other conference, really, in terms of who they are. I mean, it's in their very motto. But the Big Ten has provided the last two national champions, and you touched on it before. There's a number of teams that could be real contenders in that conference and nationally this season.
Right. Yeah. And they are in a little bit different positions. I think that both could benefit from the 5-11 format. But I think from the Big Ten's perspective, they're willing to at least have that conversation if all of our schedule models are equal. And I think what's a concern for me, I've beaten the drum like maybe harder than anyone over the last 10 years for better overall scheduling. And I know that's the conversation this week at the commissioners' meetings in North Carolina about the strength of schedule metric. It could be, I think that can be manipulated pretty easily depending on what set of data you're using, what types of teams you're playing. But I think if you say to the SEC, either you go to 9 conference games, or everyone it's part of this playoff, at least at the power conference level, must play 10 games against power conference teams. And if it's 8-2 or 9-1, so be it. But you have to do that in order to gain consideration for the playoff. And then we'll see, right? And if you want to go to 5-11 or 16 at-larges, I mean, there's all sorts of. I don't think a 16 at-larges format, by the way, is beneficial because it would leave out potentially a lot of teams that I'd love just to see them have the opportunity to get into the playoff. I mean, again, a playoff thing to me, guys, is not necessarily it. Once you've expanded past 4, you're never going to have a year where you leave someone out who can actually win. You just look at the history of college football. There's not going to be a 14 seed or a 17 seed that said, "Oh, if we just got a chance, guys, we would have run the table and won." That's just not the way it works. It doesn't. And people could say, Ole Miss was talented enough to win a national championship, and I would counter that in saying Ole Miss was not talented enough to beat LSU, an inferior team. I was at the game. Ole Miss was better, lost the game. Florida, inferior team. Ole Miss was better, lost the game. You played yourself out. That's the way it goes. And I just don't think they would have, if given a chance to be in a playoff, run the table. I just don't. I think they showed us who they were. And so once you get past a number of teams that has the right ones in, I would rather have something that's more like nationally distributive than, oh my God, it's the 6th SEC team versus the 4th Big Ten team or vice versa. Let's pull our hair out. I mean, those teams are probably going to be making very early exits in the playoff. They just are. I know there's a money component. I know there's an ego component. But I think the goal is get the teams in that can win, and then have this thing be as diverse as possible without going overboard and giving a group of 5 league 7 bids or something like that. You're going to get the right distribution. I think if you go into it with that mindset.
And of course, what we want, and we talked about this early on in the episode, is we want competition, we want excitement, and there's a danger. You used the comparison with the English Premier League, but there's a danger that if we just front load it with all the big names, you get just another version of the Champions League in this part of the world, which frankly the shine of the Champions League has already worn off, right? Because people now see AC Milan play against Real Madrid, which before was a pipe dream. And once you've had that 2 or 3 times, the shine's no longer there. And of course, the real star of the show last year was Arizona State. Not to be disingenuous to the Big 12, but they were so exciting coming through the playoff, and frankly should have beaten Texas. That's the kind of story that you want to come through. It's not necessarily about Penn State playing LSU unless that game's held on campus, but that's a story for another time. I'm glad you talked about sitting in Ryan Day's office, Adam, because we want to talk about Ohio State. Always difficult when you're a national champion how you follow it up the next year. And you talked about the changes that have happened at Ohio State. Their defensive coordinator is now defensive coordinator of another Big Ten school, and their quarterback's away off to the NFL, and they've got a transfer quarterback in. What are your expectations for Ohio State? And dare I ask, what are Ryan Day's expectations for Ohio State this season?
Right. Well, I mean, again, with Ohio State, the expectations are always high. They never fall off very far. But I think they're understanding that they've lost a lot of great players, and this is going to be very much a new team and a new season. And in some ways, that's great because it gets everybody's attention. And Ryan described this as sort of a gritty team, a tough-minded team, a team that's excited to prove that it can follow up last year, even with so many new players and possibly repeat as a national champion. And you touched on some of the changes with Matt Patricia coming in. We know a new quarterback, whether it's Julian Sayin or Lincoln Keenholz taking over for Will Howard. There's going to be a new running back, at least primary ball carrier, with Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins moving on. You're going to have new pass rushers. So really, other than a few spots, I qualify that by saying this. Ohio State might have the best two players in the country still. I think they have the best player in Jeremiah Smith. And what's crazy about his situation, I was talking with him when I was down in Columbus. I was like, dude, you have to stay here 2 more years. Like, I don't know. I don't know if I can remember a situation, guys, where a true sophomore is entering his obviously second season, and might already be the best player in the country and has to, by rule, remain for 2 more years before he moves on to the NFL. So I think they have the best overall player. They might have the best defensive player as well in Caleb Downs. He did some things last year at safety, obviously at the punt return against Indiana, that really showed why he was such a big pickup for Ohio State through the portal from Alabama. And so even though they lost 14 draft picks, they have a lot of really high level guys that are there and guys that just haven't had an opportunity yet who are now in those positions. So it's a team that might take a little while to find itself. And obviously they have a huge game right away against Texas, a rematch of the semifinal that we'll learn a lot about both teams. But, you can never count out Ohio State because of who they recruit and who they have coming back, as well as, I was talking about Matt Patricia. Sonny Styles and some of the other guys I spoke to were very complimentary of his ability to be adaptable and not just coming in and saying, hey, I was an NFL head coach, I work for Bill Belichick, you're going to fit into my system or else. He very much wants to adapt his defense to the personnel. And, this year, that personnel, I believe, is more, linebacker to defensive back focused than maybe D-line focused. Now, a lot of coaches will tell you it has to start with the defensive line, and I think there's a lot of confidence at Ohio State, but the bottom line is this is a completely new defensive line. So it'll be very interesting to see how Matt adapts to a personnel grouping where, I think your strengths are, safety, cornerback, linebacker, maybe more so than the traditional D-line spots.
I just want to touch on something you said there, Adam, before we move on to the other side of the game rivalry. Trevor Lawrence, right? This is the last time we had a Jeremiah Smith type conversation about a player who is clearly the best player in college football in their sophomore season. And there was a lot of talk then around a guy like Trevor Lawrence. Does he change how college athletics looks at becoming more pro, like a pro model where players can go to the pros after 1 year, like they do in the NBA? As college football changes and the whole landscape changes, is that, do you think, a conversation that comes up again now with Jeremiah Smith?
Yeah, I haven't heard that, and again, I think the big difference, even from Trevor's time to now, is NIL and the fact that Jeremiah Smith is being compensated extremely well to play football for Ohio State, and will continue to be obviously for the next couple of years before he moves on to the NFL. I mean, we're only talking about one obviously extra year here. So again, I think if more players are in that position, maybe I think it'll be very difficult. Just from a physical development standpoint, for those who are on the line of scrimmage to justify moving to the NFL before a certain age or a certain level of experience is in the bank. But you look at Jeremiah Smith, and you could plop him on an NFL roster right now. I mean, but he's just that rare of a player. Trevor Lawrence is a good comparison, but again, at least from what we know, he was not getting the type of compensation that Jeremiah Smith and Caleb Downs and the rest of these players are getting, who obviously will go on to the NFL and likely be very, very high draft picks.
Let's talk a little bit about Michigan. Obviously, a lot of what happens with the Wolverines this season hinges on the quarterback position. They brought in Mikey Keene from Fresno State, but it very much feels like, particularly from the outside looking in, that this is probably maybe Bryce Underwood's team to lead this season as a true freshman. What are you hearing out of Ann Arbor about Bryce Underwood, his development, and the likelihood that he does just walk into that QB1 role this season?
Yeah, I think all signs point to Bryce Underwood being the guy, in part because Mikey Keene was injured this spring, even though he's expected back for the preseason. And talking to some people at Michigan, they're very, very impressed, not just with the skill set, which they knew was there, but just how he's conducted himself, Bryce. I mean, in terms of connecting with people in the locker room and and fitting in with the guys, even though he came in really unlike any Michigan freshman has. I mean, they made a big push to land him. There's a financial piece of that, obviously, that Michigan really wasn't willing to commit before two incoming freshmen. They were to some transfers, but not so much to a player like Bryce. So it's a big moment for Michigan, and the way they ended last year. I think with his commitment, flipping from LSU, beating Ohio State, which is still one of the incredible upsets, at least that I can remember, and then beating Alabama, despite being so undermanned, taking down Alabama in that bowl game. Not that they can throw away another year. Like, they've got to compete, they've got to show that, hey, we're in the playoff conversation. But with Bryce coming in, this really feels like the start of something, and something that's going to last for Michigan for the next few years. So yeah, we're in the Bryce Underwood era, and I think he's going to get every opportunity to lead this offense in the 2025 season. And does that lead them to the playoff? Does that result in a record more similar to last year? That remains to be seen, but it'll be really exciting to see how much progress he makes, because that was an offense that we don't need to rehash it completely, but it really bottomed out last year. I mean, it was about as bad as you can be from a passing standpoint. I know they weren't an offense that was setting the world on fire even when they were winning the Big Ten, but that was a pretty steep regression for Michigan in 2024. And now, how close can they get back to where they were the previous few years with Bryce Underwood at the helm?
The big question, and I'm not going to lie, I had a little chuckle to myself when George sent me the topics through for our discussion with you tonight, because the topic of Penn State comes up every single year, and we talk about it every single year. Is this Penn State's year? And George said finally in brackets when he sent over the topics for tonight, and that's kind of it, right? It's a standing joke that almost every year it feels like Penn State have got the pieces to go all the way. I felt like it might be last year. A lot of those pieces are back this year. Is it Adam Rittenberg, Penn State's year, finally?
Yeah, as we sit here today, absolutely. I mean, I don't know how it could line up better for them, especially when you look at who they're competing against. I mean, of the four teams that reach the semifinals or beyond in the CFP, Penn State's the only one that's returning a quarterback. They're returning probably the best running back tandem in the country. Notre Dame might have a case there as well, but with Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen coming back, a lot of really accomplished defensive players. They've added to the from the portal, I think, at a position they really needed, which was wide receiver, a group that's kind of let them down, I would say, the last few years in terms of high level production. So if not now, when? I mean, like, they've obviously had many chances to break through, and they made the Big Ten championship game last year. They were competitive in that game. They won a couple of playoff games, but lost to Notre Dame in a game that I felt they were the more talented team. And so it reinforces that, can Penn State ever get it done? So those are all fair questions, but it absolutely feels like the year because Ohio State, we just went through their roster situation. Oregon, once again, replacing a quarterback, a record-setting player in Dylan Gabriel. Michigan is not quite certainly where they were a few years ago, and then the other contenders in the conference, just talent-wise, aren't where Penn State is. So it really feels like this is the year for Penn State to certainly get back to the playoff, but really make a run at its first national championship since 1986. And again, coaches and quarterbacks are always linked, guys, as you know. But James Franklin and Drew Aller, because each of them has accomplished a lot and each of them has this kind of big game stain on them, are going to be watched every step of this season. But especially in games like Oregon, which will be Penn State's first real test of the season, and then about a month later going to Ohio State. Those are the barometers now. It's not about, all due respect, it's not about beating Rutgers or Maryland or Indiana or Iowa or Illinois. Like, they've done that enough under James Franklin. You now have to beat the elite, and if you can't, you have to wonder if it's ever going to happen there.
That was actually my kind of final question was going to be, Adam, because you're closer to the school, both geographically and professionally, than the two of us. You think back to, we mentioned Ole Miss. Ole Miss were very hyped last year because of the roster they had, and a lot of people saying this is Lane Kiffin's opportunity. This is his year to mount a challenge on the CFP, and it all fell flat. I'm not comparing Penn State, but what's the pressure like for James Franklin? Because as you've just said, if not this year, when, what is the pressure like from the fan base and from the school to go that extra step and, well, certainly at least make it to the semi-finals, but to win the national championship?
Right. So, you have to go back and listen to it. I think it was after one of the home losses to Ohio State. I think it might have been 2018. And James Franklin kind of went on this rant about, where the program was, and then kind of continued, even in more recent years, about the things that were needed to get them to the level where they would have no more excuses left. And I think part of that is he wanted a new athletic director, and he wanted a president who was all in, and he wanted the infrastructure to be able to keep and add to the roster in a way that gives them the best possible chance. And you mentioned it earlier for Jim Knowles, adding Jim Knowles from Ohio State, who just won a national championship, who's a native of Philadelphia, who grew up watching Penn State football. You're keeping Andy Kotelnicki for another year as offensive coordinator, keeping Drew Aller and Nicholas Singleton and Kaytron Allen and Denai Dennis Sutton and some other really good defensive players. Zaki Wheatley was one of the breakout stars, I thought, of the college football playoff. So I think James would be the first to admit that they have it set, right? I mean, no one knows with injuries, and hopefully there's nothing serious from now until the start of the season. But they're gonna, go into that very soft non-conference schedule with an A-list roster, a roster that we'll look at and say, how does this group compare to Texas and Georgia and Ohio State? And I really think those are the three programs that, in my view, have sort of established the upper crust of the sport. I think Penn State belongs in that conversation this year. So I don't expect to hear excuses from James Franklin. And you mentioned not that he was making excuses, he was pointing out things that he felt were needed that weren't in place, that may or may not have contributed to some of these performances in the biggest of games. But I can't think of a coach who has more pressure to win at the highest level, not to necessarily keep his job or whatever. I'm not putting him on a hot seat, but to win the biggest games and show that you can win a national championship, having been at a school a really long time and has done a lot of incredible things. Now it's time to go win the big one, and we'll see if they can get it done or not.
Yeah. You heard it here. This is their year. Sadly, that's all the time we have for this episode. Adam, we know you're a really busy guy and you're about to pop off and do something else. But for our listeners' benefit, what have you got that you're working on that we can watch out for, and what's in store for the next couple of weeks for you?
Yeah, look, it'll be vacation for me coming up, thankfully. But I just put out a piece last week looking at All of the Power 4 teams in Notre Dame, looking at the next 2 years, called Power Rankings, future Power Rankings, where I ranked 1 through, I think, 68 of who projects the best through the 2026 season. So we've been talking a lot about 2025, but I also mentioned a guy like Jeremiah Smith, who will be back in 2026, and others. So which teams are best positioned to be the best over the next couple of seasons? And there's a number of them that I think really have some pressure to win a national championship.
Awesome. Thank you. That's all from us. Thanks to Adam and Ollie for their awesome input, and thanks to you for listening and continuing to support us. Stay safe and well, and catch you all next time.